A young woman got lost during a snowstorm in the Alaskan wilderness. By nightfall, she believed she might not make it home, but what happened next would change her life forever. Because hidden deep in the mountains, far beyond any marked trail, she stumbled upon an old wagon cabin that shouldn't have been there. A cabin forgotten by time. A cabin no one had entered for generations. And inside, she found something that had been waiting more than 100 years to be discovered. Something so unexpected, it would answer a question she had carried her entire life. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. On the morning of her 21st birthday, Hannah Carter woke up believing that if she disappeared, no one would notice. It wasn't self-pity. It was simply the conclusion she had reached after 21 years of experience. The first thing she saw that morning was the date glowing on her phone screen. October 14th, her birthday. For a moment, she stared at it. Then she set the phone down. No missed calls, no messages, nothing. An hour later, she stopped at a small gas station on the edge of town. The cashier, a gray-haired woman with kind eyes, smiled as she handed Hannah her coffee. "Any plans today, sweetheart?" Hannah smiled back. The kind of smile people learn when they've spent years hiding disappointment. "Meeting some friends later." The woman nodded. "Well, happy birthday." Hannah thanked her and walked away. She wasn't meeting anyone. There were no friends waiting. No family expecting her. No place she needed to be. As she climbed back into her aging RV, the lie settled heavily in her chest. At 21 years old, the only person who knew it was her birthday was a stranger she'd never see again. And somehow, that hurt more than she expected. You see, Hannah had never known her parents. According to the records, she had been found outside a children's shelter during a winter storm, wrapped in a blanket that wasn't warm enough and carrying a name that may not have even been hers. No one ever came back. No one ever asked for her. As the years passed, she moved through foster homes the way autumn leaves move through the wind, never staying in one place for long. Some families tried. Most didn't. Eventually, Hannah stopped believing that people stayed. It seemed safer that way. But loneliness has a way of growing quietly, year after year, birthday after birthday, until one day it becomes too heavy to carry. So, instead of spending another evening alone inside her RV, Hannah drove north toward the mountains. The wilderness had always offered her something people couldn't: silence. Not the painful kind, the peaceful kind. Or at least that's what she hoped. She packed a backpack, filled a thermos with coffee, and started down a trail she had never walked before. Looking back years later, Hannah would often wonder whether she chose that trail, or whether that trail had somehow chosen her. Because by the following night, she would be lost in the Alaskan wilderness. And before the week was over, she would discover something no map had ever recorded. Something hidden, something forgotten, something that had been waiting more than 100 years for a young woman who believed she had no family. What Hannah found deep in those mountains would not only save her life, it would answer a question she had carried since childhood. A question she had never dared to ask out loud. What if family isn't always the people who raise you? What if family is the light someone leaves behind for you to find? And before this story is over, that answer will change everything. By early afternoon, something about the mountains felt different. Hannah couldn't explain it at first. The trail was still there. The trees were still standing. The world looked exactly as it had a few hours earlier. And yet the wilderness no longer felt welcoming. It felt watchful. She stopped near a clearing and took a sip from her thermos. The coffee had already gone lukewarm, but she drank it anyway. Above her, the sky had begun to change. Not dramatically, not enough to alarm an inexperienced hiker, but enough to make her uneasy. The pale blue horizon was slowly disappearing behind a blanket of gray clouds. Heavy clouds, the kind that seemed to arrive without warning in the Alaskan backcountry. Hannah checked her phone. No signal. She wasn't surprised. There hadn't been service for miles. Still, she opened the weather app out of habit. Nothing loaded. Just an empty screen. A strange chill brushed across the back of her neck. She zipped her jacket a little higher and kept walking. At first, she told herself she was imagining things. The mountains had a way of making people feel small. Maybe that was all it was. But as the hours passed, the trail became harder to follow. Places that had seemed familiar earlier now looked different. The path narrowed. The forest thickened. The silence grew heavier. Even the birds seemed to disappear. Hannah slowed her pace. Something about that bothered her more than the clouds. Nature is rarely silent. There should have been birds. Wind. Something. Instead, it felt as though the entire forest was holding its breath. She stopped and listened. Nothing. Not even a distant call. Just stillness. The kind that makes your own heartbeat sound too loud. Then the first snowflake landed on her sleeve. She stared at it. A tiny white crystal. Gone almost instantly. Then another. And another. Within minutes, snow began drifting through the trees. Light at first. Beautiful, even. But Hannah knew enough about the wilderness to understand how quickly beauty could become danger. She turned around. The trail behind her looked unfamiliar. Not lost. Not yet. Just unfamiliar. Still, it was enough to make her stomach tighten. For the first time all day, she considered heading back. The problem was, she wasn't entirely sure which direction back was anymore. The realization hit quietly, like a stone sinking into deep water. She pulled out her map, studied it, turned slowly in a circle. Nothing matched quite the way it should have. The landmarks she remembered weren't there, or maybe they were hidden. Everything looked different beneath the gathering snow. The wind picked up. Cold air pushed through the trees with growing urgency. The snow was falling harder now. Visibility shrinking. The mountains around her seemed to close in. Hannah forced herself to stay calm. Panic was dangerous. Panic got people killed. She chose a direction that felt right and started walking. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. Then 30. The forest offered no answers. Every ridge looked the same. Every stand of trees blurred into the next. Snow collected on her shoulders, on her backpack, on her eyelashes. The daylight was fading faster than it should have. And deep inside, a thought she didn't want to acknowledge began to form. I might be lost. She stopped walking. The words echoed in her mind, not because they were dramatic, because they were true. For a long moment, she stood completely still. The wind moved through the pines above her. Snow drifted across the ground, and suddenly she felt very small. Not just physically, emotionally. The same loneliness she had spent years carrying seemed to rise around her. Only now there was no town nearby. No road, no shelter. No one expecting her home. The thought hurt more than she wanted to admit. If something happened out here, who would even know where to look? She swallowed hard and pushed the thought away, one step at a time. Find shelter. Stay warm. Keep moving. The advice came from years of reading survival books and listening to outdoor podcasts. Simple. Practical. Necessary. So she walked. The snow continued to fall. The light continued to fade. And then she saw something. At first, she thought it was another cluster of trees, a dark shape hidden among the forest, half buried beneath snow, almost invisible. She would have missed it entirely if she hadn't glanced to her left at exactly the right moment. Hannah froze. There it was again. Not a tree, not a boulder. Something else. Something with lines that nature doesn't make. Straight edges, angles, geometry, human geometry. Her heart began to pound. She stepped closer. The shape slowly emerged from the storm. Wood, darkened with age, partially hidden beneath generations of moss and weather. For a brief second, she wondered if she was imagining it. But she wasn't. The closer she moved, the more impossible it became. A structure deep in the wilderness, miles from any marked trail, miles from civilization. Waiting in complete silence, the wind howled behind her. Snow swirled through the trees, and standing there in the fading light, Hannah stared at something that should not have existed, something forgotten, something hidden, something that looked as though it had been waiting a very long time for someone to find it, and for reasons she couldn't explain. The moment she saw it, she felt something she hadn't felt all day. Hope? The structure stood in complete silence. Snow drifted across its roof. Wind pushed through the trees behind Hannah, carrying the low, mournful sound that only winter forests seem capable of making. For a long moment, she simply stared. Part of her wanted to believe she was imagining it. After all, she'd been cold for hours, tired, lost. But the structure remained. Real. Waiting. Hannah took a cautious step forward. Then another. As she moved closer, details began to emerge through the falling snow. Weathered timber, a narrow roofline, wooden walls darkened by decades of storms. It wasn't a cabin in the traditional sense, at least not originally. Beneath the additions and reinforcements, she could see the outline of something older. A wagon. An enormous wagon that had been transformed into a permanent home. The sight made her heart race. Who would build something like this all the way out here? And more importantly, why? The wind answered with another icy gust. Her fingers were beginning to ache from the cold. Questions could wait. Survival couldn't. She climbed the small wooden steps leading to the entrance. The door stood before her. Old, solid, remarkably intact. Snow had gathered along the frame, but the structure itself appeared stubbornly alive, as though it had refused to surrender to time. Hannah hesitated. There was something strangely intimate about the moment. Opening that door felt less like entering a building and more like stepping into someone's memory. Someone's life, someone's story. She placed a trembling hand on the latch, took a breath, and pushed. The hinges groaned softly. The door opened. A rush of still air greeted her. Not warmth, not yet, but shelter, and right then, shelter felt like a miracle. Hannah stepped inside and closed the door behind her. Instantly, the storm became distant. The wind still existed. The snow still fell, but now it sounded far away, muted, like another world. She stood quietly, allowing her eyes to adjust. The interior was dim, small, simple, and astonishingly well preserved. A narrow bench stretched along one wall. Shelves lined another. A folded table had been secured against the timber. There were hooks for coats, storage compartments, a small bunk built into the far end. Every inch of space had been used carefully, thoughtfully, the way people build when resources are limited and every decision matters. Hannah slowly removed her backpack. For reasons she couldn't explain, she found herself whispering. as though speaking too loudly might disturb something. Not a ghost. A memory. Her eyes moved across the room, and then she saw it. A cast-iron stove. Small. Old. Beautiful. It stood near the center of the cabin like the heart of the entire structure. The sight alone made relief wash through her. If it worked, she might actually make it through the night. She knelt beside it. The metal was cold beneath her fingertips, but something immediately caught her attention. This wasn't a decorative relic. This stove had been used often. The iron bore marks from years of fires, years of cooking, years of hands reaching toward warmth. Someone had lived here. Not briefly. Not accidentally. Someone had built a life here. The realization settled over her like a blanket. For the first time since becoming lost, Hannah no longer felt completely alone. The family who once occupied this place was gone. Long gone. Yet somehow their presence remained. She could feel it. In the worn edges of the furniture. In the careful craftsmanship. In the stubborn way the cabin continued standing against impossible odds. Outside, the storm intensified. Snow hammered against the walls. Darkness gathered beyond the small window. Night was arriving. Fast. Hannah knew she needed a fire. She opened her backpack and pulled out the emergency supplies she always carried. Fire starter, dry tinder, a small knife. The kind of things experienced hikers learned never to leave behind. As she prepared the stove, something near the vent caught her eye. At first, she thought it was a crack in the wood. Then she leaned closer. Words, carved directly into the timber. Simple words. Functional words. Instructions. Keep lower vent open during storms. Below it, dry spruce catches quickest. And beneath that, if smoke backs up, check the eastern pipe. Hannah stared. The handwriting wasn't elegant. It wasn't decorative. Whoever carved these messages hadn't been trying to leave history behind. They'd been trying to help the next person survive. A strange emotion tightened her throat. The instructions felt personal, as if someone from another century had anticipated this exact moment. A frightened stranger. Cold. Lost. Standing exactly where she stood now. She followed the instructions carefully. Opened the vent. Prepared the tinder. Struck the fire starter. The first spark died. The second almost did. The third caught. A tiny flame flickered to life. Hannah held her breath. The flame spread slowly through the dry wood. Smoke curled upward. For one terrifying second it lingered. Then it disappeared cleanly through the pipe. The stove exhaled. The cabin seemed to come alive. Warmth gradually spread through the room. Into the walls. Into the air. Into her frozen hands. A shaky laugh escaped her lips. Not because anything was funny. Because relief sometimes sounds like laughter. She sank onto the bench and stared into the growing fire. For the first time all day, she felt safe. The storm continued screaming outside. But inside this forgotten place, there was peace. Minutes passed. Maybe longer. Then something happened. As Hannah shifted her weight against the bench, she felt a slight movement beneath her hand. A hollow sound. Different from the rest of the wood. She frowned, turned, and looked down. Carefully, she reached underneath. Her fingers brushed against a hidden handle. Her heartbeat immediately quickened, slowly. Almost afraid of what she might find. She pulled. A concealed drawer slid outward from beneath the bench. Dust drifted into the firelight. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in faded cloth, tied carefully with twine. Protected. Preserved. Waiting. Hannah stared at it. The storm raged beyond the walls. The fire crackled softly beside her, and somehow she already knew. This wasn't money. It wasn't treasure. It was something far more valuable. Someone's story. And without realizing it, Hannah had just become part of it. The fire crackled softly inside the old wagon cabin. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault on the mountains. Wind rattled the walls. Snow swept across the roof in long, icy waves. But Hannah barely noticed any more. Her attention remained fixed on the bundle resting in her lap. For several moments, she simply stared at it. The cloth was faded with age. The twine had darkened over time. Whoever had wrapped it had done so carefully, almost lovingly, as though they understood that what lay inside mattered. Not just to them, to someone else. Someone in the future, someone they would never meet. Slowly, Hannah untied the knot. The twine loosened with surprising ease. Inside were letters, dozens of them, neatly folded, yellowed by time, their edges softened by more than a century of waiting. A strange feeling settled over her. She wasn't afraid. She felt invited, as though someone had left a light burning in a distant window, hoping that one day a stranger might see it. She carefully unfolded the first letter. The handwriting was strong but simple. The ink had faded in places, but the words remained clear. December 4th. Snow came early this year. The roof held through the night. Thank God. Lucy was worried the wind might tear it away while we slept. Hannah smiled faintly. Lucy. The name immediately transformed the writer from a stranger into a person. A real person. Someone who had worried about storms. Someone who had tucked children into bed at night. Someone who had stood exactly where Hannah was sitting now. She continued reading. The entries weren't dramatic. There were no great adventures. No shocking revelations. Instead, there were details. The amount of firewood remaining. The condition of the roof. The family's food supply. Small victories. Small worries. Small hopes. And somehow, those ordinary details touched her more deeply than anything extraordinary could have. Because real life isn't made of grand moments. It's made of ordinary days. Days people fight quietly to protect. Days spent caring for those they love. The next letter mentioned Lucy again. Lucy spent most of the afternoon drawing by the stove. She says when winter ends, she wants to see the ocean one day. Hannah paused. Without realizing it, she found herself smiling. She could almost picture the little girl, could almost hear her voice, could almost see her sitting beside this very stove, dreaming about a future she couldn't yet imagine. The cabin no longer felt abandoned. It felt occupied. Not physically, but emotionally. Every board, every shelf, every scratch in the wood seemed filled with traces of the people who had once called this place home. As the evening wore on, Hannah continued reading. Hours seemed to disappear. The storm outside faded into the background. The loneliness she carried every day began to loosen its grip. Not vanish, but soften. Then she unfolded another letter. And everything changed. The date at the top caught her attention immediately. October 14th. Hannah frowned. That was today's date. Not the year, of course. The letter had been written more than a century earlier, but the day was the same. Curious, she continued reading. Today, Lucy turned 21. We had little to give her this year. Flour is running low, and supplies have been difficult to stretch. Mary managed to save enough sugar for a small cake. Lucy laughed when she saw it, said it was the finest birthday she'd ever had. Hannah stopped breathing for a moment. 21. The same age, the same birthday, the same date. For several seconds she simply stared at the page, The fire crackled. The wind groaned outside. But inside the cabin, time itself seemed to pause. A lump formed in her throat. Not because of coincidence, because of contrast. Lucy had a father who wrote about her birthday, a mother who saved sugar for a cake, a family who celebrated her existence, someone who was grateful she had been born. Hannah looked down at her own hands. Earlier that morning, she had eaten breakfast alone. No cake, no celebration, no one remembering. For years, she had convinced herself that it didn't matter, that birthdays were just another day. That family was something other people had, not her. But sitting there beside the fire, reading about a young woman who had lived more than 100 years earlier, she felt something break open inside her. A quiet ache she had carried since childhood, the ache of never belonging anywhere. Tears filled her eyes. She didn't fight them. For once, she didn't try. The first tear landed on the page, then another. And strangely enough, those tears weren't entirely sad, because for the first time in her life, Hannah was experiencing something she had never known before. Connection, not through blood, not through obligation, through understanding, across a century of time, across generations, across lives that should never have touched. A family she had never met was somehow speaking directly to her, and they were telling her something she desperately needed to hear, that a person's life mattered, even when the world forgot their name, even when no one was watching, even when they felt alone. The realization settled deep within her. For years, Hannah had measured her worth by who stayed, who called, who remembered, who cared. And because so few people had, she quietly concluded that maybe she wasn't worth much at all. But these letters told a different story. The people who built this cabin hadn't lived famous lives. History books would never mention them. Most of the world would never know they existed. Yet everything around her stood as proof that their lives had mattered. They had loved, built, sacrificed, hoped, and more than 100 years later, the kindness they left behind was still changing someone else's life. Her life. Hannah looked around the cabin once more, but now she saw something entirely different. This wasn't merely a shelter. It wasn't just a forgotten structure hidden in the wilderness. It was a message carried across generations, a reminder that even the smallest life can leave a lasting light. The fire burned lower. Night deepened outside, and for the first time since she could remember, Hannah no longer felt like a girl wandering through the world completely alone, because somehow, inside a forgotten cabin buried deep within the Alaskan wilderness, she had found something she had spent her entire life searching for. Not answers, not treasure, not even a family. At least not yet. She had found hope, and hope, she was beginning to realize, can change everything. Morning arrived quietly. No dramatic sunrise, no golden light pouring through the window. Just a pale gray glow slowly filtering into the wagon cabin. For a moment, Hannah didn't remember where she was. She blinked at the ceiling above her. The wooden beams, the small bunk, the faint scent of smoke lingering in the air. Then it all came rushing back. The storm, the cabin, the letters, Lucy. Slowly, she sat up. The fire had burned down to glowing embers during the night, but the cabin still held a trace of warmth. Outside, the wind was gone. The silence felt different now, gentler, almost protective. Hannah pulled on her boots and stepped to the small window. The storm had vanished. Fresh snow covered the wilderness like a clean sheet stretched across the earth. The mountains looked untouched. timeless, as though nothing had happened at all. Yet everything had changed, at least for her. She stood there for a long moment before looking back at the stack of letters resting beside the stove. Yesterday, they had been a mystery. Now they felt like companions, voices from another time, waiting patiently to be heard. She rekindled the fire and settled beside it once again. The remaining letters called to her, not with urgency, with purpose. One by one, she unfolded them. And as the hours passed, the family became more real. Mary, Lucy, the father whose name appeared only occasionally, usually signed at the bottom of the page with simple initials. They worried about winter, celebrated small victories, mourned losses, dreamed about futures they might never see. In one letter, Lucy wrote about wanting to become a teacher. In another, she described collecting wildflowers during summer and pressing them between the pages of a book. There was something heartbreakingly familiar about her. Not because their lives were similar. They weren't. Lucy had something Hannah had never truly known. Belonging. Yet beneath that difference, they shared something deeper. Both had dreamed of a future they couldn't yet see. Both had wondered where they fit in the world. Both had searched for hope. As the morning stretched toward afternoon, Hannah unfolded another letter. The paper felt different, newer somehow, more carefully preserved. The handwriting belonged to Lucy's father, and the first sentence immediately caught her attention. If someone finds this one day, Hannah froze. Her heartbeat quickened. Slowly, she continued reading. If someone finds this one day, I hope it means the cabin has done what we built it to do. She swallowed hard. The room seemed quieter. Even the fire appeared to soften. We did not build this place to be remembered. We built it because winter was coming and our children needed shelter. We built it because people survive better when they leave something useful behind. Hannah felt her chest tighten. The words were simple, yet they carried a weight she couldn't explain. Outside, sunlight reflected across the snow. Inside, a man who had been gone for more than a century was speaking directly into her life. The letter continued. If this cabin has kept you warm, then it has already served its purpose. If it has given you safety, then we ask for nothing more. But if it has reminded you that kindness can outlive the people who give it, then please carry that kindness forward. Hannah lowered the page. For several moments, she simply stared at the fire. Something inside her was shifting. Something she had carried for years. For most of her life, she had believed survival was enough. Get through today. Pay the bills. Keep moving. Don't depend on anyone. Don't expect too much. Don't get hurt. Those rules had protected her, but they had also built walls around her. Walls so strong that eventually she stopped letting people in, stopped believing she belonged anywhere. Yet this family, this ordinary family who had lived and died long before she was born, had somehow reached through time and touched her heart. Not because they were extraordinary, because they were kind, because they cared about someone they would never meet, someone exactly like her, a stranger. A tear rolled down Hannah's cheek. This time she smiled through it, because for the first time, she understood something she had never fully grasped before. Family wasn't only about blood. It wasn't only about the people who gave you life. Sometimes family was the people who left a light behind when the world grew dark. The realization settled deep inside her, and with it came something unexpected. Purpose. She looked around the cabin again. The stove, the bunk, and the shelves, the carved instructions. Everything suddenly felt fragile. Not weak, precious. The family who built this place had trusted the future. trusted that someday someone might find what they left behind, someone who would understand, someone who would care. What if that someone was her? The thought startled her. Yet the more she considered it, the more it felt right. Not accidental, not random, almost like an invitation. Then something else caught her attention. Near the base of the bench where she had discovered the letters, a section of flooring looked slightly uneven. At first she ignored it, but curiosity eventually drew her closer. She knelt, ran her fingers across the wood. There, a small gap, almost invisible. Her pulse quickened again. Carefully, she pressed downward. The board shifted. A hidden compartment. For a moment she simply stared. Then she slowly lifted the panel. Inside was a cloth-wrapped bundle, smaller than the letters, heavier. Protected from moisture and time, Hannah carefully unfolded the fabric. Her eyes widened. Old coins, a pocket watch, several folded documents, property records, family certificates, photographs faded nearly white with age. Not wealth, not treasure, legacy. The physical remains of an entire family's existence. Proof that they had lived, proof that they had mattered, proof that they had once loved each other beneath this very roof. Hannah sat back on her heels. The cabin suddenly felt larger than before, not because of what she had found, because of what it meant. This wasn't just a forgotten shelter hidden in the wilderness. It was a story waiting to be saved. And for the first time in many years, Hannah no longer felt like someone drifting through life without direction. She felt entrusted, as though fate had placed something valuable in her hands and quietly asked, "What will you do with it now?" The answer hadn't fully formed yet, but one thing was already certain. When she left this mountain, she would not be the same person who had arrived. Something new had begun, and deep in her heart, Hannah knew it. The hike back should have felt familiar. It didn't. Every tree seemed different now. Every ridge, every stretch of untouched snow. The mountains themselves hadn't changed. But Hannah had. She stood outside the wagon cabin for a long moment before leaving. The cold morning air brushed against her face. Behind her, the little structure remained silent among the trees. Hyacinth, unassuming, as though it had no interest in being discovered. And yet, somehow, it had changed everything. Hannah reached into her backpack and carefully checked the bundle of letters one more time. The documents remained wrapped securely. Protected, safe. She wasn't taking them because they belonged to her. She was taking them because someone had to make sure their story survived. For over a century, the wilderness had guarded that family. Now the responsibility had passed to her. The thought was both comforting and terrifying. With one final glance at the cabin, Hannah turned and started walking. Snow crunched beneath her boots. The forest stretched endlessly around her. But something felt different. For the first time in years, she wasn't simply moving forward because she had no other choice. She was moving toward something. Toward purpose. Toward meaning. Toward a future she suddenly wanted to see. Hours passed. The mountains slowly awakened around her. Birds returned. A distant breeze moved through the pines. The world no longer felt empty. And as strange as it sounded, Hannah no longer felt empty either. The loneliness was still there. Of course it was. A lifetime of loneliness doesn't disappear overnight. But it no longer felt like a prison. It felt more like an old wound finally beginning to heal. Around midday, she stopped beside a frozen stream to rest. She removed her backpack and sat on a fallen log. The letters weighed almost nothing. Yet, somehow, they felt heavier than anything she had ever carried. Because they represented more than a family's history. They represented proof. Proof that ordinary lives mattered. Proof that kindness survived. Proof that even people forgotten by history could still change someone else's future. Someone like her. As she sat quietly, her thoughts drifted back to the letter written by Lucy's father. Please carry that kindness forward. The words echoed in her mind. Carry it forward. Not preserve it. Not admire it. Carry it forward. There was a difference. One looked backward. The other looked ahead. For most of her life, Hannah had been focused on surviving her past. Maybe now it was time to build a future. The realization felt unfamiliar. Hope often does. Eventually, she stood and continued walking. The afternoon sun hung low above the mountains. Shadows stretched longer, and then she noticed something unusual. Footprints. Fresh footprints. Hannah stopped immediately. Her pulse quickened. The tracks crossed the snow roughly 30 feet ahead. Large boot prints. Recent. Very recent. She stared at them. The snowfall from the previous night should have buried anything older. Yet these impressions remained sharp. Distinct. Someone had been here recently. Very recently. A second set appeared nearby. Smaller. Different. 2 people. And maybe more. A cold sensation moved through her chest. Instinctively, she looked back toward the direction of the cabin. Impossible. The place had seemed untouched. Forgotten. Hidden from the world. Yet these tracks suggested otherwise. Someone else knew. For several seconds, Hannah simply stood there. Listening. The forest remained silent. Nothing moved. Nothing revealed itself. But the discovery unsettled her. Not because she felt threatened, because it changed the story. Until now, the cabin had felt like a message left behind by the past. Now it felt connected to the present. The possibility lingered in her mind as she resumed walking. Who else knew about that place? Why had they never come forward? And perhaps most importantly, what would happen if the wrong people found it first? The question stayed with her for the rest of the afternoon. By evening, she finally spotted something she hadn't seen in nearly 2 days. A trail marker. Weathered. Familiar. Real. Relief washed over her. Not the dramatic relief of someone escaping danger. Something quieter. Deeper. She had made it. Hours later, the parking area appeared through the trees. Her RV sat exactly where she had left it. Snow covered the windshield. Otherwise, nothing had changed. Yet, as Hannah climbed into the driver's seat, she realized everything had changed. She looked around the small vehicle. The same worn blanket. The same coffee mug. The same cramped living space. Only a few days earlier, this had felt like the entire world she would ever know. Now it felt different. Smaller somehow. Not because she wanted more possessions. Because she wanted more purpose. For several minutes, she sat in silence. The engine remained off. The letters rested on the passenger seat. Waiting. Finally, Hannah picked up her phone. There was still no signal. She wasn't surprised. But as she drove farther down the mountain road, service eventually returned. A few bars appeared, then more. Her screen lit up. No missed calls. No messages. No one looking for her. A week earlier, that realization might have hurt. Now it barely registered. Because for the first time, Hannah understood something important. Her worth was not determined by who remembered her birthday. It was not determined by who called, or who stayed, or who left. The family in that cabin had taught her that. They had lived meaningful lives without recognition, without applause, without guarantees, and somehow their kindness had survived longer than they ever could. As dusk settled across the mountains, Hannah pulled into a small roadside diner. She ordered coffee, sat by the window, and stared at the letters. People moved around her. Waitresses carried plates. Families laughed in nearby booths. For years, scenes like this had reminded her of everything she lacked. Tonight felt different. Not because she suddenly belonged there, because she finally believed she might belong somewhere. The thought brought an unexpected smile. Then she opened her phone. After a brief search, she found the number for the Regional Historical Society. Her thumb hovered over the screen. For a moment she hesitated. Making this call would change everything. The letters would become public. The story would no longer belong only to her, but deep down, she already knew what the family would have wanted. Their lives weren't meant to remain hidden forever. They were meant to be remembered. Hannah pressed the call button. The phone rang twice. A voice answered. "Regional Historical Preservation Office. How can I help you?" Hannah glanced once more at the bundle of letters, then out the window toward the fading mountains. And softly, almost reverently, she said, "I think I found something important." At that moment, she wasn't just saving a forgotten story. She was beginning a new chapter of her own. And neither journey was finished yet. The call lasted less than 10 minutes, but it changed the course of Hannah Carter's life. At first, the woman on the other end of the line sounded polite but skeptical. That wasn't surprising. People called historical societies all the time claiming to have found something remarkable. Most hadn't. But as Hannah carefully described the wagon cabin, the carved instructions, the letters, and the hidden compartment beneath the floorboards, the tone of the conversation began to change. By the end of the call, the woman was asking questions faster than Hannah could answer them. Where exactly was the structure? Had anything been removed? Were the documents safe? Could she meet with someone the following morning? For the first time since finding the cabin, Hannah realized the discovery might be even more significant than she had imagined. Not because it was valuable, because it mattered. A week later, she found herself standing beside a team of historians, preservation specialists, and surveyors as they followed her back into the mountains. The journey took nearly an entire day. The trail was difficult. The snow still lingered in shaded areas, and several times, Hannah worried they might never find the cabin again. But late that afternoon, one of the surveyors suddenly stopped. There. His voice was barely above a whisper. Everyone turned, and there it was, standing quietly among the trees, exactly where she had left it. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The historians simply stared. One older man removed his glasses and shook his head slowly. Another woman covered her mouth with her hand. Not because the cabin was grand. Not because it was beautiful. Because it was real. A piece of history that should have disappeared long ago, yet somehow hadn't. The cabin had endured. Storm after storm. Winter after winter. Decade after decade. Waiting. The lead historian entered first. The others followed carefully behind. Hannah remained near the doorway, watching, listening. As experts examined the letters and documents, a feeling of peace settled over her. She wasn't worried anymore. The story was safe now. The family was safe. Their voices would not be lost again. Months passed, then more. Researchers spent countless hours studying the letters, the documents, the photographs, the history hidden inside that forgotten cabin. What they uncovered amazed everyone. The family had been among the earliest settlers in that region. The wagon cabin represented a rare example of frontier ingenuity and survival. But it wasn't the historical significance that captured people's hearts. It was the humanity. The letters, the birthday cake Lucy's mother had made from the last bit of flour and sugar, the father's quiet determination, the family's hope during impossible winters. People saw themselves in those pages, and they couldn't forget them. Eventually, the story reached local newspapers, then regional publications. Soon, visitors were traveling from neighboring towns just to hear about the remarkable discovery hidden in the mountains. Yet, through all of it, Hannah never felt like a hero, because she knew the truth. She hadn't created the story. She had simply listened when it called. The following summer, the cabin was carefully relocated to a regional museum where it could be preserved for future generations. Every board, every shelf, every carved instruction, restored exactly as it had been found. On opening day, hundreds of people attended. Families, teachers, veterans, retirees, children. Many stood silently in front of the exhibit for far longer than anyone expected. Some read every letter. Others studied every photograph. A few wiped tears from their eyes, and Hannah understood why. Because the cabin wasn't really about history. It was about something much larger. It was proof that ordinary lives matter. One afternoon, several months after the exhibit opened, Hannah stopped by the museum as she often did. She wasn't employed there. She simply liked visiting. Sometimes she would sit quietly on a bench and watch people move through the exhibit. There was something comforting about it, something healing. That afternoon, an elderly couple entered the gallery. They moved slowly, hand in hand, gray-haired, gentle, the kind of couple who looked as though they had spent a lifetime together. They stood before the cabin for a long time, reading, whispering, remembering things only they understood. Eventually, the woman noticed Hannah sitting nearby. "You found this place, didn't you?" she asked. Hannah smiled. "I did." The woman nodded thoughtfully. Then she sat beside her. For the next hour, they talked. Not just about the cabin, about life, about loneliness, about family, about the strange ways people find each other. At some point, the conversation shifted toward Hannah's childhood, her years in foster care, her life alone. The birthdays no one remembered. The woman listened quietly, without interruption, without pity. When Hannah finished speaking, the older woman reached over and squeezed her hand. "You know," she said softly, "sometimes family arrives later than expected." The words lingered. A few weeks later, shortly before Thanksgiving, Hannah received a phone call. It was the couple. They invited her to dinner. At first, she almost declined. Old habits are hard to break. People leave. That's what she had always believed. But this time, she said yes. And on Thanksgiving afternoon, Hannah found herself standing on the porch of a warm home, filled with laughter and the smell of roasted turkey. The door opened. The older woman smiled, and without hesitation said the words Hannah had never expected to hear. "There you are." Not "hello," not "come in." "There you are." As though they had been waiting for her, as though her place at the table had always existed. For a moment, Hannah couldn't speak. She simply stood there, overwhelmed by a feeling she had spent her entire life searching for: belonging. Years earlier, she had entered the mountains believing she was completely alone in the world. She had gone searching for silence. Instead, she had found a family. Not the one she expected, not the one she was born into, but perhaps the one she needed. And as she sat around that Thanksgiving table, surrounded by people who genuinely wanted her there, Hannah finally understood the lesson hidden inside those century-old letters. Family is not always the people who share your blood. Sometimes, family is the light someone leaves behind. and the courage to follow it when you finally find your way home. A year passed. The cabin remained. The letters remained. But Hannah Carter was no longer the same young woman who had walked into the mountains believing she didn't matter. The story of the Wagon cabin spread quietly through the community. Visitors came. Students came. Families came. And little by little, Hannah found something she had spent her entire life searching for. Not answers. Not fame. Belonging. Then October arrived again. Her 22nd birthday. Hannah arrived at the museum expecting an ordinary day. Instead, she found a small cake waiting beside the old Wagon cabin. A few museum volunteers stood nearby. The elderly couple who had become part of her life were there too. Nothing extravagant. Just a cake, a handful of people, and 22 candles. For a moment, Hannah couldn't move. A year earlier, no one had remembered her birthday. Now there were people waiting for her. People who were glad she existed. As everyone sang, Hannah looked toward the cabin. Toward the place where a family she'd never met had changed her life. She thought about Lucy, about the father who built the cabin, about the kindness that had survived more than 100 years. And suddenly she understood. The cabin had never been about history. It had never been about survival. It was about connection, about the light we leave behind for people we'll never meet. At the beginning of this story, Hannah believed no one would notice if she disappeared. Now she knew better. And maybe that's the lesson hidden inside all of this. You don't have to be famous to matter. You don't have to change the world to leave a legacy. Sometimes a small act of kindness can travel farther than we ever imagine. Far enough to reach a stranger. Far enough to change a life. And sometimes, far enough to help someone find their way home.